So when's a good time to start?
Well, our DAS is here, so we can start.
Did we click on videotape already? Videotaping?
Recording is on, according to the system.
Okay.
Wonderful. It's what you call feedback. Should we just wait a minute to see, are there loads of people coming in, more people, or are they just dribs and drabs trickling in? Oh, well, we like a trickle.
Well, Zoom says there are 37 people.
Okay, well, that's more than us, so perhaps that's a good way of starting. So, you folk ready? Shall we go? Yep. Okay, Wolfgang? Yep. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody to what is the 10th and sadly final Bergin and Garfield Handbook webinar. I'm tempted to say all good things must come to an end. Sadly, this is the last one, but who knows about the future? So we'll wait and see. Anyway, what we have today is myself, Wolfgang, and Louis giving our brief 15-minute presentations. But first of all, rather than doing acknowledgements at the end when people have drifted off to tea, coffee, lunch, or whatever, I thought it would be nice just to acknowledge all the people who not only wrote chapters for the handbook, but also devoted time to giving the webinar in this series. And first of all, of course, uniquely to the late Alan Bergin and also to Michael Lambert for the opening sort of presentation of the handbook, not officially one of the 10, but I think historically that will now show to be quite a historical document in itself. We then had 9 presentations, and my personal thanks, together with those of Wolfgang and Louis, to Steve Holland, Simon Goldberg and Scott Baldwin, Sarah Knox, Clara Hill, Heidi Levitt, John McLeod and Bill Stiles, Mary Beth Gibbons and Bruce Wampold, Robert Elliott, Jacques Barber and Mickey Freelander, Michelle Newman and Evan Foreman, Gerhard Anderson and Gary Burlingame, and Mi Ning and Zach Cohen. And of course, these webinars are only possible because they're supported by good folk, and special thanks to Juan, Mila, and Martin for their support in the technological setting up and advertising of these webinars. So if people are interested in seeing the other 9 or plus the first one together with this one, then they can be seen on this link here, YouTube channel of SBR, and they'll stay there for forever, as far as we know. So I think that's all I need to say before introducing Wolfgang to have his 15 minutes or thereabouts. We're not timing this really. We're just enjoying the last meeting of this series, and off you go, Wolfgang.
Thank you, Michael, and yeah, welcome also from my side to all of you and for everybody in the webinar, and also thank you to everybody involved over this whole period of the last 2 years, actually, I think. And I'm presenting chapter 4, measuring, predicting, and tracking change in psychotherapy. And this chapter was done together with Kim de Jong and Julian Rubel and Jamie Delgadillo. And on the right side, you see the pictures of us, how happy we were when we finished the chapter, when the handbook finally came out. And it was a really very nice experience to do this chapter. And you can see how relaxed and happy we were in this. Here, Julian just moved at the time. It was the first book in his new shelf to have the handbook. Now going back to the content side, the measurement of change in psychotherapy has developed considerably. And I use always this sentence a little bit, and I actually, to start discussing about that chapter, in the early days, the main question was whether change in psychotherapy could be measured at all. And if you look to the several editions of the handbook, you can see them also here a little bit. I have them in my bag, as well as the new one. That was really an issue around measure. Can we measure progress and outcome in psychotherapy? And now I think we are in a situation where we more discuss how change can be optimally measured, how often it should be measured, and how therapists can make the best use of change measures in clinical practice, but also how to implement this into clinical training as a learning about using measures in clinical practice, how this could be implemented in clinical training. And in some way, I make a little bit this reference to another field, the astronomy, the development of telescopes. You see, if you look with the pure eye into the sky, you see not so much. When you look in this area, it's called the pillars of creation. That's an area like 4 light years away with a lot of gas, and where stars and planets are just created in a way. And you see with the Hubble telescope, the technology of the 80s, and then the James Webb telescope, like the current technology, how much progress this means and how more clearly things can be seen. And you can also see it's a never ending. You can always improve. And I think in some way now, coming back to Earth, to our field, it's the same thing. I mean, we need to continue improving our measures and to develop measures and to apply them into our research projects and into practice. So the whole chapter is all about measuring and modeling change in psychotherapy. And we have at the beginning, of course, we talk about defining change, quantifying change, the psychometric issues like classical issues of measurement, and measurement domains and targets like the demographics, clinical factors, personality factors, dispositional factors. You see this in this figure from the chapter, process measures, problem, and as well as consequences. And then we go further than talking about statistical and clinical significant change. Like it's not only looking at averages, but also to look at idiographic, the evaluation of change processes. We talk about effect sizes and meta-analysis, dosage, treatment length, and treatment attrition, as well as follow-up measurement and the handling of missing data. And then also we talk about new ways of measures and modeling change, item response theory in terms of precise, to make our measures more precise, multi-level and mixture modeling, as well as more intensive assessment, ecological momentary assessments, or biological and technological measures. So this is all covered at the beginning of the chapter. And then we talk a little bit, when we talk about effect sizes, give an example comparing psychological treatments with medical treatments, with different ways to express effects, here with effect sizes or numbers needed to treat or probability of superiority. And I mean, just as a sideline, psychotherapy, of course, works. We all know that. But of course, it is also, in comparison to a lot of medical treatments, shows really good effects. Like here in this example, corticosteroid treatment of chronic asthma, or just rheumatoid arthritis as examples. Now, we also talk about the multidimensional perspective here, for example, on therapist effects. So we have therapist effects measured as outcome variable usually. So therapist differences we find not only in outcome, but also in treatment length and dropout. And those variables or dimensions might not be correlated to outcome. But what you can see here, for example, we have kind of a super shrink, really a high effect size in outcome for this therapist, and low dropout rate and short treatments for this therapist. Now, higher effect sizes show shorter treatments or low dropout rate. Now you can see this in the right end. Can you see my mouse, by the way? Can you see the mouse? Okay, this is the really high performing therapist. And this is less so good performing therapist, like a low effect size in outcome, high dropout rate, long treatments, all controlled for initial impairment, for example. But interesting are also those therapists here, where we have like a high effect size. They do very well, but they have on average treatment length, but they have also high dropout rate. For some reasons, some patients do not stay with those therapists, and those patients which stay, they seem to be effective. Now, we also talk about predicting and understanding change. So exploring processes and mechanisms, as well as predictors and moderators, go back to the expected treatment response literature, as well as decision rules, using empirical information to give feedback to therapists and developing decision rules on, for example, not on track patients, using patterns of change and early response information as predicting further progress over the course of treatment, as well as looking for processes and mechanisms, discussing patient and session level variation, and know the discussion about between and within variants when discussing process mechanisms, as well as dyadic models and synchronicity issues, new developments also in psychotherapy research. So we have the patient factors, therapist factor, therapy processes, and the wider context covered as potential issues of measurement. We also come then to a patient-focused research and routine outcome monitoring as like the most implemented procedures where we use measures in our field and discuss like not on track cases, or it's especially helpful for not on track cases, and used also in addition with clinical support tools. This is a study or meta-analysis then published also by Kim De Young, and we discussed the different issues, advantages and different disadvantages of different procedures, and the possibilities using clinical support tools to improve feedback and routine outcome monitoring, and also move then on to a more personalized or precision mental health perspective, including these tools or this clinical support or problem-solving tools in more detailed feedback systems. Now, this is here an example of a treatment navigation system we developed in Trier, where we also give feedback on motivation issues, therapeutic alliance, social support, critical life events, risk and suicidality, as well as emotion and self-regulation issues. And I'm coming to the final conclusions and future directions from that perspective. Louis will later discuss a little bit more on this, so I'm really will be short here. I think we'll see in the future more on this whole issue on precision, personalization, and measurement-based care. Maybe this leads also to more clearer conceptualization of trans-theoretical aspects in our field, and also the whole issue of using measures in clinical training and practice as part of a clinical identity, I think that's also a future development coming out of this whole debate about improving measures and implementing measures in our field. It might also lead to a better focus on patients at risk for treatment failure. So moving a little bit away from average comparisons to patients with a risk of treatment failure where we're not having really successful treatments yet. Another new development is new measures and designs, like highly intensive assessments, as well as maybe using video analysis or other new digital measures, which also leads to new issues around multimodality in measures in the future. And I think also replication, prospective, and cross-validation studies definitely stay an issue, as well as the implementation of measures on a broader base in different settings. Like we try this now in the European consortium, and I know there is also an initiative in Latin America using like a similar measure in different setups, in different cultures, including minority groups and underserved populations. So, but as more intense the measures get, you see this on the figure at the side, as more you can use that information to support your treatment, but on the other side, it gets more challenging in implementation, and I think that will be that kind of tension will stay, and then as further we develop our measures, as more challenging it will get, and the discussion will increase around the issues of implementation and how well this can be actually done. And used in different setups. So I think I'm through with the 15 minutes, and I will stop here and will pass on to you, Michael.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, just to explain that Wolfgang is operating the forward and back slides. So every now and then I will say next slide, and hey presto, the next slide will come. So this is chapter 5. We're going in sequence, 4, 5, and then Louis. And this chapter, yeah, sorry, go to the next one. Yeah. So this is a joint chapter with Mike Lambert. And I just wanted to kind of spend a few minutes just expressing the kind of personal philosophy behind it. So the chapter was built on the legacy of Mike Lambert's 2013 chapter. So everything I wrote in the chapter, I had Mike in my mind very much. And I wrote it as much as I could imagine that Mike would, in a sense, approve of. So it is very much a joint chapter built on his legacy, and I want to make that very clear. My aim in writing the chapter was very much to provide a review, being as fair as I could to reporting authors' accounts of how they perceived the state of the art. And that kind of came very much from my kind of mentoring from David Shapiro, who always tried to take an even-handed approach, always aspired to having a level playing field. It's one of these traditions of England being rather football mad, using analogies like level playing field. But anyway, but what I tried to add to it, well, not add to it, it was there, but what I tried to emphasize was a primacy on the methodology and be a critical friend. And I suppose this comes from my view as historically that in some ways I've never particularly minded what the results of a study are, providing we get the methodology right. And the results are simply what come out of good methodology. So that was my approach. Having said that, I have tried to give a sense of direction and tried to balance my commitment to trials methodology, but also to practice-based evidence. And in a moment of sort of clear thinking, I did actually manage to write a sentence in the latter part of the chapter, which, if we had been using epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter, then this is what it would have been. Namely, unless we get the practice of research right, we will not provide the right research to underpin and inform practice. And I think that is what the chapter tries to emulate. Okay, next slide. So towards the latter part of the chapter summarizes 7 particular themes or issues as listed here. So the first couple are to do with design. The third is really kind of the conduct of trials. The fourth is really what I felt to be particular focus topics of reward that would yield interesting results. And then following on that is actually about delivery and delivery to the people that matter, i.e. patients and clients. And then how we maintain the gains in longer term follow-up, and eventually ending up, as in fact the handbook does, really addressing the whole point about delivering treatments at scale. Okay, so I'm just going to go briefly through each of these, just making several points. Okay, next slide. So meta-analysis, trials, and variability. So let's be clear, meta-analysis is wonderful. And if anyone has read the chapter, they'll find at least 15 references to meta-analysis by Pim Kuipers, together with other ones as well. But on reflection, I just want to add a cautionary comment, and that is some very kind of eminent and respected researchers over a period of time have just drawn some cautionary notes about our use of meta-analysis. So I remember David Shapiro kind of back in the 1980s saying basically that between study confounds are the enemy of disaggregation. Scott Baldwin wrote a lovely short commentary on one of Pim Kuipers' meta-analysis, drawing out kind of shortcomings with making comparisons between different studies. There's a wonderful opinion piece by Stephen Gold and colleagues, which included David Moore. And I would advise anybody who's interested in trials methodologies to make reference to that. It's published 2017 in Lancet Psychiatry. But it brings up the shortcomings of aggregating data from trials. And of course, Gene Glass himself, in sort of reviewing meta-analysis in a sort of midlife stage of meta-analysis, never saw it as the be-all and end-all in the end. And in fact, what he saw is ultimately moving towards were large, huge data archives. But the one quote I actually cited in the chapter was, I had many wonderful text interchanges, email interchanges with Steve Holland. And what he simply said was that basically meta-analysis should be a starting point and not an end point. And I thought that was such a sort of insightful perspective to take, that we don't just simply run to meta-analysis as being the answer, but actually starting a question. And I just like that perspective. Which takes me to trials. And the bottom line here is that we still need either larger or smarter trials. We are still carrying out trials that are vastly underpowered, or not very smart. So we can power trials better by embedding them in routine practice. But we can also employ smarter sequential multiple assessment randomized trials. Also trials such as leapfrog trials. In other words, trials where actually the stages of the trial component mimics treatment decision-making pathways in that kind of way. And in that way, you can understand, rather than trials and practice-based being poles apart, I think there's a sort of a perspective in which trials are trying to reflect real-world clinical decision-making pathways in that way. And I think that gives promise for bringing trials methodology and practice-based methodology together, particularly if we harness them with the power of embedding them in routine practice. And then variability is something which is better captured the larger the trial is. We capture the patient variability, but also we can start addressing the long lost sort of adage that people say, well, actually, yes, we powered for main effects, but of course, underpowered for moderators. So we need larger trials, better power in order to be able to address the whole issue of moderators. And I'd also like to flag variability is not only between factors, but it's also intra-variability, and just flagging up the work of Aaron Fisher there. Okay, next slide. So I like alliterations, so controls, comparators, and contrasts. Controls have a huge impact on outcomes. And this may seem obvious, but it really does stand stating and restating. And again, this is wonderful work of David Moore. But he made this statement back in 2009. Control conditions remain dark matter exerting effects that are unseen, ill-defined, and for the most part, unquantified. And it's certainly the case that if you look at the effectiveness of psychological therapies, you end up with a different result or a different effect size, certainly, as a function of the control group. So control groups are actually fundamental, and I think we sort of don't consider them sufficiently. Comparators, yes, comparators between active conditions, but they need to be credible alternatives. I think for many years ago, there were kind of what we might call straw men candidates to show the effectiveness of a candidate treatment. And I think that's absolutely no longer either ethical or do we learn anything from that. But we do have, as Alan Kasdan has long said, we do have difficulties defining treatment as usual, which might be seen as a standard comparator. And then contrasts, and increasingly, certainly, it would seem to me anyway, that when we contrast one treatment with another or one factor with another, what we end up with are small effect size. And I think we are in the world in that respect of investigating smaller differential effects, which should not be dismissed, because if we're aiming to deliver treatments at scale, then we need larger sample sizes, and then the smaller differential effects become meaningful because we're working at a population level. Okay, next slide. So those were design issues. In terms of cost effectiveness and outcome, in terms of the conduct of a trial, I think we are poor, to say the least, at taking account of cost effectiveness. Certainly, it was a struggle to get current data for the chapter, and I relied very much on the same source that Mike Lambert had used back in 2013. And I think we need to engage health economists much more. And there is no reason why any trial, or in fact any study, shouldn't actually use the EQ5D. I have no investment in the EQ5D, Euroqual 5D, it's only 5 items. but it's a health utility measure which enables people to make cost evaluations of the utility of an intervention against sort of financial costs. Certainly in the UK, in England, with NICE, that is a primary consideration. And then in terms of outcome measurement, well, it's clear that we're dominated by monosymptomatic measures. And funders, again, certainly in England, actually stipulate that we have to use PHQ-9 and GAD-7, but not to the exclusion of anything else. And I think all trials, we need to ensure better bandwidth, what I would say bandwidth of measures, and specifically functioning, quality of life, and idiographic, going back to Monty Shapiro, David Shapiro's father. And also the use of routine outcome measure as embedded in routine practice. I think that's, if we can build that kind of infrastructure of outcome measurement, which Wolfgang has very much referred to, then I think we can strengthen the linkage between practice-based and trial-based research. Okay, next slide. So here there are three sort of themes: therapist effects, severity, personalized approaches, because it feels like these are areas of potential promise. So in terms of therapist effects, much to Mike Lambert's credit, having had Larry Butler make every effort over successive editions of the Handbook, then changed tack and invited Scott Baldwin and Zach Immel to write about therapist effects. And that theme was continued by Bruce Wampold and Jesse Owen in the 7th edition. And for those people, there's no reason why anyone should look at Google citations, then it's a credit to this theme that in fact the Wampold and Owen chapter is currently the most cited chapter in the Handbook. But just in case Bruce Wampold is in the audience, only by a little, don't get carried away. But from the perspective of looking at trials and therapist effects, I think it's important perspective that, in my view, certainly therapist effects are the quintessential practice-based variable. They exist and exert considerable influence in routine practice. But remember that in trials, the effects are attenuated, as all effects are, in a sense, controlled, such that only the treatment is the main difference between the conditions. So it's taking therapist effects evidence from trials is they're high. We certainly found them in a review some years ago by Johns, variable, and they're likely to be unreliable. Having said that, I think the reporting of therapist sampling in trials is extremely poor. We have to do much better at understanding how therapists were selected in terms of the pool of potential therapists available, and also the number and assignment of people to therapists. In other words, how much influence did particular therapists have in terms of the overall findings of a trial? So I think there's some interesting methodological issues there, but also some interesting substantive issues as well. Severity, maybe it's stating the obvious, but in so many areas, whether it's treatment effects, therapist effects, matching, or whatever, where we look at mild or moderate patient severity, there tends to be little, if any, difference. It's actually only when we get to the higher severity, more severe patients, do differential effects become much more salient. And in that way, I think we need to kind of ensure that our efforts in terms of psychological therapies or looking at different treatments or effects focus on the high severity, and that we don't sort of, in a sense, wash out those effects by including mild and moderate. And then the third area is personalized approaches. Now, remembering that we made decisions on the chapters 4, 5, 6 years ago, maybe. But there was enough interest there in personalized approaches, and that's the initial work of Rob DeRubis and Zach Cohen. And since then, I think it's been proved that even though there are issues, which Zach kind of covered in his webinar some time ago, the potential of machine learning and the whole impact of AI is becoming so manifest that, in a sense, I think this is an area that will actually run and run. Next slide. So, changing from topics to the sort of delivery, which obviously, in a sense, it's a research chapter, but one's trying to recognize the impact that this has, or the research has, on people in need. So dose effect, and which was Ken Howard's model, and the rise of the good enough level model, which was very much an insight of Bill Stiles. I think for me, both are candidates in different situations, and I think it's healthy that we have now at least a competing model, not only the dose effect model, but also the gel model as well. And the fact that actually the gel model is based on what seems to me to be an eminently credible, sensible, clinical basis, which is that individuals change at different rates. I think that's so fundamental that actually underpins that model. And in terms of service delivery, I think it's healthy to have arguments against predetermined durations in that way. So I think the dose effect, good enough level models of how much has been taken forward. But then there's also the issue about breadth, really. Diverse populations. Specifically, there is the whole point that I would dread to think what percentage of research is accounted for by depression. Depression, yes, is a world leader, but I think we need to be looking at more diverse populations, and that's also particularly cultural adaptations, but also socioeconomic. The people who come into trials tend not to be those people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And I think we would do well to include something like the index of multiple deprivation as a variable that we use here in England, as a context, a social context for understanding the world that patients live in, rather than just the 1 hour of therapy in which they have contact with a service. Okay, next slide. So the last two themes were maintaining gains and longer-term follow-up. So it just states the obvious that, the effort of putting into treatments, we need to be better at maintaining gains, reducing relapse. And in terms of follow-up, we tend to be very proximal in terms of our follow-ups. And yet I think we need to become more distal and looking at, for example, 18-month and 24-month follow-up, and actually trying to include routine health service data. And again, this is a kind of an argument for, in a sense, a greater meeting between trials and routine data that sits out there at, in a sense, no or low cost, that would actually tell us a lot about the impact longer term of our interventions. And then the final theme, scalability. We need to be thinking larger scale and in relation to equity and access, which of course is a theme in England in the what used to be called Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, now rebranded as Talking Therapies. But actually to reach out to all those patients in need in terms of equity and giving them access to psychological therapies. So next slide, which is my last one. So I've fallen foul of my love of alliteration again. Science, social, and scalability are my three major themes. So basically, we need the yield of both trials and practice-based evidence. We need smarter trials, larger trials, focusing on both precision and mechanisms of change. We need to be understanding better why things work and why things don't work. But we need them integrated with routine practice that focuses on health service delivery systems becoming learning health systems by actually implementing routine outcome measures and actually then generating their own data and learning from that data and contributing to trials embedded in those systems. And then the social context, we need greater inclusivity of patient conditions, there's breadth for patients, accounting for the social context, and a greater focus on therapists themselves and the delivery, notwithstanding interventions that use internet or technology, but in some ways they should equally be informed by what we learn about effective therapists. And then finally, scalability. We need to move towards focusing on impact at scale. So yes, we can talk about effect sizes, which means something to us, but not a lot to people out in the wider world. We need to be talking about the numbers of people we're actually helping, the numbers of people that we've changed, what's made a difference, how many people have actually been helped as a function of X rather than Y, and convert it into a language that actually people can understand in the real world. And I think that's my 15 minutes. So I'll pass on now to Louis.
Many thanks, Michael. Many thanks, Wolfgang, for the slides. So I'm going to briefly talk about the chapter that Michael and I, as well as Soo-Jun Yoon and Andrew Page, have contributed to the 7th edition of the Handbook, and a chapter that is really focused on something that Michael has already mentioned about, which is practice-based evidence. That is findings that emerge from the clinical routine. And as Michael has done, and Wolfgang too, I'm going to focus more on some of the themes or the area of investigations that researchers that are conducting practice-oriented research from which we derive practice-based evidence have focused on. But first, next slide, exactly. I'm going to define very briefly what we mean as a team. There's arbitrariness, of course, in terms of definitions of practice-based evidence, but from our perspective, what we mean by this is essentially data that or studies that are characterized by a number of key features. The first one is that these are studies that are collected as part of the routine of clinical practice. So it's really the evidence that is being collected is evidence from the clinical routine as it is practiced in the day-to-day interventions. It's also data that reflects this everyday practice. So it's not like a study that is being conducted in clinical routine that is not independent from what typically the clinicians are doing, but it's really reflecting how the service are delivered in different kind of setting, of course. The research questions do not involve researchers impose change, for example, in prohibiting some interventions to be used by the clinicians, or by having the clinicians to use some interventions that they typically do not use as part of their day-to-day practice. So these are the three main characteristics or features. It can be conducted by clinicians, either clinicians alone or as a group of clinicians within or across setting, but it also can be conducted in collaborations between clinicians and other stakeholders, including but not restricted to researchers, because that could also mean administrators, for example. The role of the practitioner, and this is something that Michael has focused a lot on, is a central focus, both in terms of what is being investigated, but also as participants in the research activities. And ideally, it would lead to results at two levels. At the level of practitioner themselves, so that they can actually use the data and the results that are emerging from the analysis of this data to have a better understanding of what is taking place in their setting, and to lead them to improve their setting, but also hopefully to contribute to science in general, so that the empirical foundations of psychotherapy or psychosocial interventions are not restricted only to randomized clinical trials that are being conducted in controlled setting. So we really want to present these practice evidence and evidence-based practice as two distinct but also complementary source of data for the scientific foundations of our interventions. Next slides, please. Briefly, we also described in the chapters what and we really want to have an ownership on this, and there's even disagreement in our group of what PBE are not study of. So this PBE does not include research that is being conducted in control setting or settings that are created for researchers, by researchers. So a very good example of this is randomized clinical trials that are being conducted in control setting that are outside of the day-to-day practice. PBE do not include studies that are conducted in naturalistic settings, but with the aim of assessing a treatment program that is created primarily for research purposes. So a good example of that would be in effectiveness studies that researchers are conducting, and often with collaborations of clinicians. It is being conducted, and once the study is being done, then the clinicians return to their own practice. They may be influenced by the randomized clinical trials, the effectiveness study that has been done, but that effectiveness studies is a standalone in time, and it's not reflecting what the clinicians would actually doing outside of this research protocol. Naturalistic settings that have been specific inclusion or exclusion criteria for research purposes would also not be included in practice-based evidence. Now, we should say that PBE or studies on PBE can include investigations of a treatment protocol that can be a manualized treatment protocol given to a specific population, as long as this treatment protocol is what is being used as a standardized treatment in a specific setting. So there have been some studies that we summarize that have looked at the process and or the effectiveness of a manual intervention for psychotic patients, for example. But this manualized treatment was actually what is being used or implemented as a treatment in the day-to-day practice of that setting. PBE typically does not include randomizations unless the randomizations is not related to the delivery of routine practice. So, for example, the famous studies of Mike Lamberg that actually look at compared in a randomized way different type of feedback that emerge from routine outcome measurements, and it provides different type of information to the clinicians but does not impose any prohibitions or does not impose any interventions to be conducted by the clinicians. In other words, it may have an impact on practice, but does not have a direct influence or does not impose to the client any kind of drastic change on the part of the clinicians in their private practice. Next slides, please. In the chapters, we covered specific type of practice-based evidence, but I should say that, as Wolfgang had already mentioned, that one type of practice-based evidence or one type of practice-oriented research is specifically about patient's focus. And was covered this type of practice-based evidence in the chapter 4 that Wolfgang and his colleague has contributed to the handbook. What we covered in our chapters are research that kind of fostered these patient change. And as part of this practice-based evidence covered in our chapter, one type of practice-based evidence or practice-oriented research is practice research network, which is not defined by the type of intervention or the type of research, but more by a more active, systematic collaborations between different stakeholders, whether it is clinicians, researchers, graduate students, faculty member, administrator, clinical staff. That's collaborations in different aspects of the study, including choosing what we're going to be investigating, how we're going to design the study, how we're going to implement the study, and how we're going to disseminate the results, involve a different level of intensity, but it does involve the collaborations of different stakeholders. The next slides, please. And so what I'm going to briefly talk about now is some of the area of practice-based evidence that we covered in the chapter. One of the main area is about outcome. And so we present a number of studies that looked at the practitioner level, again, the emphasis that Michael have talked about of the therapist. So we covered, we described several studies that look at the therapist effects as measured in the day-to-day clinical routine. So what's part of the variance of the clients that is being explained by the different level of effectiveness of the therapist in the day-to-day practice. And in the chapter, we looked at different level of effectiveness with regard to different kind of populations, such as race and ethnic minority clients, or different types of impact, such as dropouts or attendance. Are there some therapists that are better at reducing or preventing dropouts, or at increasing the attendance of the clients in the therapy? We also looked at studies that measure the impact or the effectiveness of a specific clinic, whether it's a theoretically based clinic, like a psychodynamic type of interventions base, or specific population. I mentioned earlier about looking at psychotic clients. So what is the impact of those clinic, and what is are they the benchmark with what is being found in randomized clinical therapy? This has also been done in many of these studies. We also looked at studies that look at the outcome of aggregated setting. So for example, 2 hospitals in Kenya, what is the impact or the effectiveness, the client change in these 2 hospitals? We also look at studies that measure, that compare, for example, the impact of cognitive behavior therapy and counseling across more than 100 settings in the UK national health systems. We also looked at the effectiveness with regard to other impact than symptom change, such as dropout or attendance. And then we reviewed many, many studies conducted in a day-to-day clinical setting with regard to the alliance. I must say that with regard, especially the alliance, but also process measure, we were very impressed by the use of very sophisticated and very cutting edge technology, statistical technology that has been used in these studies. Studies, for example, that looked at within client change and not only between client change. Studies that look at the clients and the therapist convergence with regard to the alliance in terms of the correlations, but also in terms of the discrepancies of the score between the clients and the therapists and the alliance, and how this could actually predict the outcome. Actor and partner analyses that were done with regard to the alliance, as well as patterns of change across the treatment. All of that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, in the day-to-day clinical routine. There's also been studies that have been looking at the predictor of and how much of the therapist techniques, whether we're talking about one single technique or different type of techniques, may have on the client change. And we also looked at studies investigating clients and the therapist's experience, emotional experience, cognitive experience during the treatment. Next slides, please. We also summarize a number of studies that have looked at the correlations between various participant characteristic and outcome, whether it's about demographic, level of severity, expectations, preference, interpersonal issues, but also clients and therapist matching. For example, in terms of similarity with regard to gender, or complementarity with regard, for example, of attachment style. One of the most exciting type of or focus or area of investigations of practice-oriented research are studies that look at contextualized variables, which are, of course, very difficult to investigate it from a context of randomized clinical trials, such as the center effect. We know, Michael mentioned that briefly, that of course, who we see as a therapist makes a difference, especially clients that are very high in terms of symptoms at pretreatment. But practice-based evidence is also showing us that where we see which center that the clients is actually receiving the treatment also makes a difference. And so is where the clients lives. So there is a neighborhood effects. More research needs to be done by this, but there's very interesting research that shows that there's an effect of treatment that is based on where the clients actually live. And we also summarize other contextualized variables such as training and supervision. Next slides, please. So what we are presenting is in this chapter is a wide range of empirical investigations that represent the complexity of the day-to-day practice. The reason why this wide range is in part explained by the fact that we have clinicians and researchers that have worked together from different regions in the world: Argentina, Canada, Chile, Germany, Israel, Kenya, Scotland, Sweden, the UK, US are among the countries that were represented in our chapters. The studies that have been conducted in different clinical settings, whether it's hospital, outpatient clinic, whether it's private practice, whether it is a treatment residential context. There's also, the chapter is showing how practice-based evidence is being derived from a multiplicity of methods used to capture the complexity of the process of change, including correlational and experimental design, multi-level modeling, and qualitative analyses. And we also talked about the fact that PRN, POR research and the PBE practice-based evidence should have an impact on psychotherapy, both in terms of the clinical settings where the research is being conducted. So when you actually have a study that's being conducted in one setting, there is no problem anymore with regard to the external validity. because the study is about, or the finding is about the treatment settings where it is being conducted and could be implemented. But we also making a very strong, we hope a strong argument that these type of evidence should also being part or being or counted in any kind of training or practice guidelines based on empirical research. And we end the chapter talking about what is the next steps that we should be doing. What we should really try to define, and we offer a kind of a preamble of this, of what are the characteristics of high quality practice-based studies. And we also offer our suggestions of how to foster PBE studies and their impact. I talked about this chapter, and Michael, Wolfgang, and I agree that we should spend a little bit time in talking about some of the themes that have been covered by the different chapters that were included in the 7th edition. So the next slides, please.
Louis, maybe one issue. We have now 1 hour already, so maybe we take it short that we open it for discussion.
I think we should do that, and we should just tell you very briefly that we covered listed some of the themes that cut across the different chapters, as well as our suggestions about where we should do next. But indeed, I agree. Let's open this up. That's going to be much more interesting.
Should we open the discussion?
We should.
Michael? Are there any questions, remarks, discussion issues?
We're open to any comments about what we've been talking about or anything to do with the handbook. It's our final farewell, au revoir, or whatever. So, ask away.
Robert?
Do you have any plans for another edition?
That's a very good question, Robert. And I'm sure somewhere there's a very good answer. Yeah. Who knows? Who knows?
I guess a follow-up to that would be, I mean, I just know from the chapter that I did that it's an enormous amount of work, and you guys did your own chapters plus edited everyone else's. So I can imagine that, you're just thinking now about how much time and effort you put into this rather gigantic task. And I mean, what was that like for you? I mean,
yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting, you get into something and it just becomes your world. And I think all three of us, and maybe this is kind of at the root of the association with SPR as well, it's you do it because you just know the value of it. And I think in very early on, I forget now, there was someone aired that actually we should drop the Bergin and Garfield. And, in a sense, bring it up to date. And it was a no-brainer. That's just, why would And I think what we have felt, and I think this is about that, is actually the balance of tradition, the history of it. And I think that was really brought home with, Alan being able to kind of be there that first time. but also trying to have some sight to where things are going without sort of, but I suppose it's more about evolution than revolution. So you're trying to capture those topics that you think this shows promise, this looks like where we're going, rather than just going for something because it's current flavor of the month or something like that. And maybe I'm kind of waxing a long way around to that kind of classic statement. I think in the end it becomes a labor of love, and that's the way you do it. And I would like to stop the phone. I would like to say that actually there was no time during the, however it was, 6 years we were doing this, 5 years, that it was not enjoyable, that we did not learn from each other, and we did not learn from the contributors as well. And I think we would all want to pay our respects and thanks to all the contributors as well, because they all played ball. They did what they were asked and they didn't misbehave. And that made such a difference. And it just made it thoroughly enjoyable. Now, whether something being enjoyable means you want to do it again is a different question. But I don't know whether Wolfgang and Louis want to kind of chip in. I know Marv has got his hand up, but maybe just to give Louis and Wolfgang an opportunity just to add their bit, and then I can see Marv anyway. Yeah.
I can definitely only agree, Michael. I mean, this is really was really a special thing to do, the handbook, and it was a real honor for me and to do a lot of work and to spend a lot of time into this. I also actually, because Marv is raising his hand, I would be also interested to get some feedback from you. I mean, in terms of course, probably most of the people in the Zoom meeting have probably experience with it, have read it, have seen the chapters. So if you give feedback on this way, that would be very nice too. I mean, not only our perspective, but also the perspective from you as the readers and the audience. But Louis, yeah, what's your view? Yeah.
Well, I'm very anxious to see what Marv thinks, but I think essentially to me, in a way, it was a very personal experience because, like many of you, I grew up on the handbook, and both the privilege, but also the anxiety. I think of the three, I probably experienced more anxiety just thinking about, I cannot believe that I'm co-responsible to do this. But there was also a tremendous amount of pleasure of just having access to cutting edge knowledge. So I don't remember having had the feeling of, I think I start to know about psychotherapy now than when I was editing that.
Marv, yes. You need to, we can't hear you yet, Marv. Marv, we can't hear you. Now. No, it doesn't work.
He's not muted.
You're not muted, Marv.
No, he's not muted, so he's unmuted.
Yeah, something doesn't seem to work with the setup. Louis, you know Marv very well. Do you know what he wanted to?
Oh, go, Marv.
Now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. I am so incredibly impressed by so many things. Certainly the way the field has advanced and the technology that's involved is just amazing. The amount of work is amazing. But perhaps what is most amazing of the three of you and your dedication to the field, you clearly were not paid enough to do this. There's no money value that could be put to it. So I think you all deserve a wonderful round of applause, and that's not enough. There's wonderful appreciation. And I took your silence about the question of, do you plan to do it again, as providing a very clear answer. So the question is, where do we go from here on this? I think there's enough material here to keep us going for a while. And what I would love to see, and I'm not suggesting that I'm going to do it, nor am I at all suggesting that any of the three of you do it, but somebody should do it, is go through the findings and make a list of conclusions that could be passed on to the practicing clinician. I think it'll be very hard for the practicing clinician without training in methodology to really appreciate what you have done. And I think there's an enormous gold mine here that could be tapped. Lots of theses and dissertations from all over the world. I would just love to read about those findings. Any reactions? Louis, did you predict what I was going to say?
Not your eloquence, but I was kind of like, yes, I was kind of like, he's going to come up with two things. And one will be, all right, so what can we derive from this clinically? And then the other aspect, which has always been central to your career, is, all right, so how can we influence and be influenced by the new generations of researchers?
Yeah.
So it would be indeed really amazing to have publications that would have 3 sections, and one sections that could be, okay, so, you know, what are the potentially robust heuristics, you know, things that might influence the way you plan a treatment, that you have a case formulations on the findings. What are some of the interventions that you might consider as in your portfolio of intervention as this is likely to be helpful, and whether or not it is attached to a specific theoretical orientations. And then a second part, which would be, all right, so what's missing? You know, what are that the area of research that is not covered by the handbook, or just a few of research that's been done and that actually can be taking place. And then, of course, the third section, which be the most interesting, is a combination of these two. Is how can we conduct some research that is actionable, and that the actual actionability of these interventions can lead to more research. It's a good agenda for the future, Morgan. You can actually do that once you get tenure.
Okay, John, I can see you've got your hand up. Oh, you're mute. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're fine.
No, yet.
Yeah, so it's an enormous gold mine. And as a trainer, specifically, how do you see the future of this gold mine actually being implemented in training practices? Or what's the state of the art? How do you see training? How do you see research actually being disseminated and implemented and embedded into training practices on the ground where we're training our future psychotherapists? Thank you.
I mean, from my point of view, I mean, already, I think what changed really in the last 10, 15, or 20 years is in some way that like psychotherapy research plays a larger role. I would say, at least, I'm not sure Marv and others along around can say more, that plays a larger role in clinical psychology training programs. I think at least in many programs around the world. And in some way, I think the handbook had quite some impact on this development. So even so, not every chapter leads directly to clear clinical implication in some way, the whole setup of the handbook really has quite some impact on the field and on its professionality, is my impression. And in some way, this has changed also, given that new research methods and possibilities have increased over the years. So we work now with larger databases. We have better designs in some way as in early days. We have increased practice-based evidence. So I think in some way this kind of information has some impact into clinical training and teaching. But you could make, some other people may have other impressions and can say more about this. Yeah, Michael, did you want to say something on this?
No, I mean, I think it's a very, am I mute?
No.
I think it's a very valid point. But I suppose the point about the handbook is it is a research handbook, and in that sense, you know, it's not directly written for training, so there is a gap there to be breached, and you might hope that if in fact trainers can actually get access to the handbook or courses, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe ensure that, you know, there's a copy of the handbook at every course and helping to inform the trainers, and then they disseminate that. There needs to be a kind of a trickle down model of the evidence to get to training practice. But I think it's a long haul, you know, progress is slow, I think, when it comes at that level, but I'm no expert in terms of training.
John, I think your question is absolutely crucial. You know, I bet from a North American perspective, I bet that there is a lot of CBT program that where the handbook would not be viewed as a main source of information, and this might be a kind of a consequences that the handbook has been so closely associated with SPR. But I think that the major value of it is to kind of say, there is no reason now to there is no reason to avoid or to pay little attention to empirically supported treatment. And here's the evidence. But also, that's way too limited. in terms of the scientific foundations of psychotherapy. And there is an unbelievable amount of evidence that could guide our understanding of psychotherapy, and therefore that clinicians in training should be exposed, that are complementary to treatment manuals that have been supported. And this evidence is about different issues related to the therapists, related to training per se, related to clients' variables, related to different modes of delivery of treatment. So to limit ourselves to empirically supported treatment is clearly a major faux pas in the literature. And to actually not pay attention to this is also a major faux pas. So in that sense, I think that the handbook should indeed have an impact on training, to kind of say, look, there's a lot there. You're not dictated by, we should not be dictated by the evidence, but we should not ignore it. There's some important informations that may surprise you, irrespective of your theoretical orientations and your epistemology.
Right. Do you think there's no more questions? Oh, Marv.
Marv, we can go a little bit over time, so it's the last webinar. Marv, yes.
Okay. I remember sitting in the office of my primary care physician, and I was telling him about something that was going wrong. And he had a laptop. And he says, let me check. He typed something into the laptop. And then he came out with an answer to my question, which was very helpful. Do we think that this could ever happen with psychotherapy? Where there'd be a resource that would be available to the clinician?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, in my opinion, some of our developments, when we use tools to give feedback to therapists, and not only on progress on the symptom level, but also on the alliance or other process measures, we can already provide this. Like for example, in our clinic, we really try to do this. We have this navigation system which really provides this kind of information, or if there's, for example, a problem in the motivation or in the alliance itself, or motion regulation or suicidal ideation, all this information comes to the therapist just on time. So in some way, we are about to develop as a field into this direction. Even so, I mean, as Michael said, it is really going slowly, of course. But overall, the new possibilities in measures and developments in designs, it looks like that we develop in a similar direction as you describe it, Marv. In my opinion, at least. I mean, there might be different views on this, but yeah.
It would be important for other facilities and even independent clinicians to know about this.
Yeah. Kim, you might have a comment on this topic too.
Yes, I just wanted to refer to sort of, there's a new, I think, white paper at this point, or maybe not yet published, about sort of digitally supported treatment from Stanford. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting that they highlighted was to have sort of the clinician being aided by technology, not just in feedback, but also on like having treatment protocols readily available, or other information. And of course, now with ChatGPT and all the information that we can get through that, I think that's really going to change the way that we, hopefully, that clinicians are supported and have access to information that was typically only available on paper, or people might not have access to. And of course, there's a lot of things of like what goes in, comes out, and is it reliable? There's a lot of concerns, obviously. But I do think that there's a lot of development in this area and that it's going really quickly, especially on the AI side of things. At the same time, we have to be careful, but I do think that's a dynamic that's currently sort of happening in our field. That it would be important for us as a society to really pay attention to, both from the concerns of validity and from the opportunities that it provides.
Okay.
Just a very brief comment. At least 30 years ago, homeopaths already had a computer-based system to type in the symptoms, and it would come up with a set of suggestions in probable order of relevance.
Okay, Chris Perry, I think Yeah.
Yeah, I have a thought listening to the AI comment and also to the question of the next edition. So I propose a little test. And I think that one of the editors could pick one chapter, take all of the chapter subheadings and headings, put it into an AI platform and say, please write this chapter. We would like it to be, tell them the number of pages you want and how many references you'd like, and see if it replicates your chapter. Of course, if the chapter is already in the AI, of course, it might just pull it out. But if it does anything that even resembles it, I think we should all be both pleased and worried at the same time.
I'm not sure if that's the new handbook looks like that.
But seriously, that would really be a good test of whether AI at this point in time is going to be able to replicate knowledge or just hallucinate it.
It's hallucinating sometimes, yes. We do some kind of research with these tools, with AI tools in our department, and indeed it sometimes hallucinates. So we don't want to have chapters which include hallucination information. Yeah. So Michael, Louis, what do you think? Should we have now 20 minutes overtime? Should we?
Yeah, I think we're time for people to go their own way and go and have something to eat and drink or whatever. So yeah, can I just, as a final word, my huge thanks to Wolfgang and to Louis. I've probably said this before, but working with them, it's like working with this supreme German engineer about precision on one hand, and then on the other hand, this emotive sort of food-loving, wine-loving kind of bonhomie person on the other hand. And it's kind of like two opposites just work. It's like we meet at the other end, and I was in the middle, and it was totally enjoyable every minute. And so my thanks to them, and my thanks to yourselves for being here, and maybe we'll see you again in Ottawa or in Europe. But anyway, many thanks for attending, and all the best to you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.